Green. This evening, Books and Books is very happy to welcome Ms. Susan Southard, presenting her new book, Nagasaki, Life After Nuclear War. Ms. Southard holds an MFA in creative writing from Antioch University in Los Angeles and was a nonfiction fellow at the Norman Mailer Center in Provincetown, Massachusetts. Her work has appeared in the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, Politico, and Lapham's Quarterly. Nagasaki was the finalist for the J. Anthony Lucas Work in Progress Award, sponsored by Harvard University's Nieman Foundation and the Columbia University School of Journalism. In it, Ms. Southard takes readers from the morning of the bombing to the city today, telling the first-hand experiences of 5 survivors, all of whom were teenagers at the time of the devastation. She weaves together dramatic eyewitness accounts with searing analysis of the policies of censorship and denial that colored much of what was reported about the bombing, both in the United States and Japan. Here to tell us more about it, please give a very warm welcome to Ms. Susan Southard.
Thank you, Victor. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here tonight. I really appreciate it. Just move this over here to have a little more room. Tonight, I'm going to read several excerpts from my book to give you a glimpse of the complex and layered story of post-nuclear survival. And after the reading, we'll have time for questions if you'd like. The first segment I'll read, I'm going to try to find a better angle here with the light. The first segment I'll read begins at the exact moment the bomb was dropped over Nagasaki from a specially modified US B-29 bomber 6 miles overhead. By this time in the book, readers have been introduced to the 5 survivors whose stories are woven throughout the book. All of them, as Victor said, were teenagers at the time of the bombing. The 5-ton plutonium bomb plunged toward the city at 614 miles per hour. 47 seconds later, a powerful implosion forced the bomb's plutonium core to compress from the size of a grapefruit to the size of a tennis ball, generating a nearly instantaneous chain reaction of nuclear fission. With colossal force and energy, the bomb detonated a third of a mile above the Urakami Valley and its 30,000 residents and workers. At 11:02 a.m., a super brilliant flash lit up the sky, visible from as far away as Omura Naval Hospital, more than 10 miles over the mountains, followed by a thunderous explosion equal to the power of 21,000 tons of TNT. The entire city convulsed. At its burst point, the center of the explosion reached temperatures higher than at the center of the sun, and the velocity of its shock wave exceeded the speed of sound. A tenth of a millisecond later, all of the materials that had made up the bomb converted into an ionized gas, and electromagnetic waves were released into the air. The thermal heat of the bomb ignited a fireball with an internal temperature of 540,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Within 1 second, the blazing fireball expanded from 52 feet to its maximum size of 750 feet in diameter. Within 3 seconds, the ground below reached an estimated 5,400 to 7,200 degrees Fahrenheit. Directly beneath the bomb, infrared heat rays instantly carbonized human and animal flesh and vaporized internal organs. As the atomic cloud billowed 2 miles overhead and eclipsed the sun, the bomb's vertical blast pressure crushed much of the Urakami Valley. Horizontal blast winds tore through the region at 2.5 times the speed of a Category 5 hurricane, pulverizing buildings, trees, plants, animals, and thousands of men, women, and children. In every direction, people were blown out of their shelters, houses, factories, schools, and hospital beds, catapulted against walls, or flattened beneath collapsed buildings. Those working in the fields, riding streetcars, and standing in line at city ration stations were blown off their feet or hit by plummeting debris and pressed to the scalding earth. An iron bridge moved 28 inches downstream. As their buildings began to implode, patients and staff jumped out of the windows of the Nagasaki Medical College Hospital, and mobilized high school girls leapt from the third story of the Shiroyama Elementary School, a half a mile from the blast. The blazing heat melted iron and other metals, scorched bricks and concrete buildings, ignited clothing, disintegrated vegetation, and caused severe and fatal flash burns on people's exposed faces and bodies. A mile from the detonation, the blast force caused 9-inch brick walls to crack, and glass fragments bulleted into people's arms, legs, backs, and faces, often puncturing their muscles and organs. 2 miles away, thousands of people suffering flesh burns from the extreme heat lay trapped beneath partially demolished buildings. At distances up to 5 miles, wood and glass splinters pierced through people's clothing and ripped into their flesh. Windows shattered as far as 11 miles away. Larger doses of radiation than any human had ever received penetrated deeply into the bodies of people and animals. The ascending fireball suctioned massive amounts of thick dust and debris into its churning stem. A deafening roar erupted as buildings throughout the city shuddered and crashed to the ground. It all happened in an instant, 13-year-old Yoshida remembered. He had barely seen the blinding light half a mile away before a powerful force hit him on his right side and hurled him into the air. The heat was so intense that I curled up like surume, dried grilled squid, he said. In what felt like dreamlike slow motion, Yoshida was blown backward 130 feet across a field, a road, and an irrigation channel, then plunged to the ground, landing on his back in a rice paddy flooded with shallow water. Inside the Mitsubishi Ohashi weapons factory, Do Mineko had been wiping perspiration from her face and concentrating on her work when pato, an enormous blue-white flash of light burst into the building, followed by an ear-splitting explosion. Thinking a torpedo had detonated inside the plant, Do threw herself onto the ground and covered her head with her arms just as the factory came crashing down on top of her. In his short-sleeved shirt, trousers, gaiters, and cap, Taniguchi had been riding his bicycle through the hills in the northwest corner of the valley when a sudden burning wind rushed toward him from behind, propelling him into the air and slamming him face down on the road. The earth was shaking so hard, he said, that I hung on as hard as I could so I wouldn't get blown away again. 15-year-old Nagano was standing inside an airplane parts factory, protected to some degree by distance and the wooded mountains that stood between her and the bomb. A light flashed, she remembered. Pika! Nagano too thought a bomb had hit her building. She fell to the ground, covering her eyes and ears with her thumbs and fingers, according to her training, as windows crashed in all around her. She could hear pieces of tin and broken roof tiles swirling and colliding in the air outside. 2 miles southeast of the blast, Wada, the young streetcar driver, was sitting in the lounge of Hotarujaya Terminal, talking with his friends. The train cables flashed. The whole city of Nagasaki was... The light was indescribable, he said. An unbelievably massive light lit up the whole city. A violent explosion rocked the station. Wada and his friends dived for cover under tables and other furniture. In the next instant, he felt like he was floating in the air before being slapped down onto the floor. Something heavy landed on his back, and he fell unconscious. Beneath the still rising mushroom cloud, a huge portion of Nagasaki had vanished. Tens of thousands throughout the city were dead or injured. On the floor of Hotarujaya Terminal, Wada lay beneath a fallen beam. Nagano was curled up on the floor of the airplane parts factory, her mouth filled with glass slivers and choking dust. Do lay injured in the wreckage of the collapsed Mitsubishi factory, engulfed in smoke. Yoshida was lying in a muddy rice paddy, barely conscious, his body and face brutally scorched. Taniguchi clung to the searing pavement near his mangled bicycle, not yet realizing that his back was burned off. he lifted his eyes just long enough to see a young child swept away like a fleck of dust. 60 seconds had passed. I found that most Americans know little about the acute and long-term effects of radiation on the survivors' bodies. The details here are graphic, but since it's such a critical part of their post-bomb lives, and because as a nation America has averted its gaze for 70 years, I've selected a short excerpt to give you a sense of what happened early on. You'll hear the name Dr. Akizuki. He's a young physician who's a secondary character in the book. Within a week of the bombing, thousands of men, women, and children across Nagasaki and the surrounding region began to experience inexplicable combinations of symptoms: high fever, dizziness, loss of appetite, nausea, headaches, diarrhea, bloody stools, nosebleeds, whole body weakness, and fatigue. Their hair fell out in large clumps, their burns and wounds secreted extreme amounts of pus, and their gums swelled, became infected, and bled. Purple spots appeared on their bodies, at first the size of about the size of a pinprick, one doctor recalled, but growing within a few days to the size of a grain of rice or a pea. The spots were signs of hemorrhaging beneath the skin. Infections throughout the body were rampant, including the large intestine, esophagus, bronchial passages, lungs, and uterus. Within a few days of the appearance of their initial symptoms, many people lost consciousness, mumbled deliriously, and died in extreme pain. Others languished for weeks before either dying or slowly recovering. Even those who had suffered no external injuries fell sick and died. Some relief workers and victims' families who had come into the hypocenter area after the bombing also suffered serious illness. Fear gripped the city. As the pattern of symptoms, illness, and death became clear, some people pulled on their hair every morning to see if their time had come. Believing the illness was contagious, many families turned away relatives and guests who were staying with them after the bombing, and some farmers outside Nagasaki refused food to hungry refugees from the city. At first, Dr. Akizuki and other physicians suspected dysentery, cholera, or possibly some form of liver disease. Others thought the illness was due to poisonous gas released by the bomb. By August 15th, however, that's 6 days later, when Japanese scientists confirmed that an atomic bomb had been dropped on Nagasaki, physicians deduced that what appeared to be an epidemic killing their city was somehow related to radiation contamination. This discovery was helpful in ruling out contagious diseases and other conditions, but it did nothing to minimize the mystifying, confusing, and terrifying truth about the invisible power of the bomb. People died koro, one after another. Dr. Akizuki likened the situation to the Black Death pandemic that devastated Europe in the 1300s. Observing the cremations taking place in his hospital yard, he wondered if his body, too, might soon be burned. Life or death was a matter of chance, of fate, he said, and the dividing line between the man being cremated and the doctor cremating him was slight. A second wave of radiation illnesses and deaths swept through the city in late August and early September and continued through early October. Dr. Akizuki and his whole staff came down with nausea, diarrhea, and fatigue, which, he remembered, made me feel as if I had been beaten all over my body. From Dr. Akizuki's perspective, from his burned-out hospital on top of Motohara Hill, death carved a clear geographical path. The first people who suffered and died from radiation illness were living inside an air raid shelter at the bottom of the hill. The illness then climbed the hill, killing people in relative order according to their distance from the atomic blast. When the next tier of people grew sick, they were carried to the hospital grounds by their neighbors who lived farther up the hill, and the distance between the homes of the sick and the hospital became shorter and shorter. The Maekawa family, the Matsuokas, and then the Yamaguchis were attacked by radiation sickness, Dr. Akizuki remembered. I named this widening advance of the disease the concentric circles of death. He watched as his neighbor, Mr. Yamaguchi, lost 13 members from atomic bomb sickness. After each death, Mr. Yamaguchi carried the body to the cemetery, dug a grave, and called for the priest. After each ceremony, he returned home to care for the remaining family members, all of whom had fallen ill. They are dying one by one, he told Dr. Akizuki. Who will send for the priest when I am dying? Who will dig my grave when I am gone? At the same time that this was happening in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, high-level officials in the United States were adamantly and publicly refuting the news reports out of both cities that large numbers of people were suffering and dying from radiation exposure. In late August and early September, for example, General Leslie Groves, director of the Manhattan Project where the atomic bombs were developed, tried to deflect public discussion about the bomb's radiation effects by insisting on the lawfulness of the bomb's use and their decisive role in ending the war. The atomic bomb is not an inhuman weapon, he stated in the New York Times. I think our best answer to anyone who doubts this is that we did not start the war, and if they don't like the way we ended it, to remember who started it. Later that year, General Groves testified before the U.S. Senate that death from high-dose radiation exposure is, quote, without undue suffering and a very pleasant way to die. There's so much to the story of life after nuclear war, and I hope you'll have a chance to read the book if it's something that interests you. For now, I'm going to skip ahead 10 years to 1955 and then into 55 and 56, and tell you a story about Do Mineko. Do was 15 at the time of the bomb, and she was the one inside the Mitsubishi weapons factory that imploded on top of her, and thousands of men, women, and children who were also working there. In wartime Japan, by 1944, I think it was, every child over the age of 14 had to leave school and work for the war effort, and her assigned task was to work in a torpedo factory, a Mitsubishi torpedo factory. I'd like to tell you that I met Do when she was 73 years old. And she made a remarkable impression on me, more than any other Japanese woman I've ever met. I was in the Nagasaki Atomic Bomb Museum in a conference room, and I was sitting at one end of a very long table, and she entered from the back right corner from my perspective. And just entering the room, and then she stood in front of the door there for a moment, she took my breath away. She stood so incredibly tall and dignified and strong and fierce. And I could feel this from across the room. I learned later that as a child, Do was athletic and strong-willed, and she sometimes broke the rules, which if you have a chance to read the book, you'll see happens quite a bit in the book, in her life. The photo of Do in the book when she was young, as a child, shows her in street clothes on a day that she was supposed to be wearing her school uniform. She really liked to look nice. You'll hear the word hibakusha in this segment. It means atomic bomb-affected person, a word created to identify the victims and survivors of the bombs. I need to catch you up just a little bit because you know that the factory imploded on top of her, but 10 years have passed. At the time of the bombing, she barely escaped out of the factory ruins. Remarkably, almost everyone in the area she had been in died, but she didn't. She was very severely injured and had a huge gash from one ear all the way to the other, so big that she could fit her fist into it later when she discovered it. But she escaped the factory ruins, and she fell unconscious on a embankment as she waited for someone to find her. In the first few months, her father did find her that day, and carried her 4 miles home on a broken door that he found in the ruins. And in the first few months, purple spots appeared on her body. She ran a high fever, her gums were inflamed, and she lost all of her hair. Her doctor told her parents that she was dying and that it was time to let her go. But Doe survived. Eventually, most of her radiation-related symptoms disappeared, and her injuries, for the most part, healed. But year after year, her hair would not grow back. So Doe hid inside her house, staring at herself in the mirror. This is a common experience for many, many survivors whose hair didn't grow back, or whose facial or body disfigurement was so severe that they were too ashamed to go out of their homes. She stared at herself in front of the mirror. Soft, raggedy fuzz would grow on her scalp, so thin and transparent that she looked almost bald, but even that would fall out, and then grow in, and then fall out again. Why me, she fumed. Why do I have to stay so ugly? I didn't do anything. She asked herself over and over again what she should do with her life that she had been given. 8 years after the bombing, she finally came to realize that she needed to find a way to transcend her atomic bomb experience and somehow create a new life for herself. Desperate to overcome her shame and reclaim her life, Doe put on the black kerchief her mother had made for her and stepped outside her house. She stayed close to home at first, taking short walks only in her immediate neighborhood. Later, she heard that people called her the girl with the triangle cloth. Doe's father decided she should go to dressmaking school so she could eventually support herself and have a good life. The commute to the school required her to venture farther from home. One day, on her way home, she saw a fatigued, middle-aged woman sitting on a straw mat on the ground with a young child strapped to her back. "Could you give me something?" the woman begged. "Anything is fine." Doe dropped some coins into her box and was overwhelmed by the sad and lonely sound they made. What kind of life had this woman had, she wondered. Did she lose her husband in the war or the atomic bomb? On her way home, Doe imagined what it would be like to live like this woman and was awakened to the crucial necessity of her own independence. She quickly found a part-time job as a kitchen worker making takoyaki, grilled dumplings with octopus. Some months later, she was hired as a Nagasaki representative for a cosmetics company. For the first time since the bombing, Doe felt alive again and began envisioning a future for herself. She decided that she wanted to live an authentic and full life for herself and for her many friends who had died. Reconnecting to her love of fashion, Doe focused her vision on cosmetics as a way to help young hibakusha women whose faces were scarred and burned. As time went on, she wanted to push herself and test her potential. She wanted to leave her hometown and move to a bigger city. Making a rare choice for a single Japanese woman, Doe requested a transfer to her company's head office in Tokyo. "The place for fashion," she said, "the place for anything." Her application was accepted, but Doe's parents adamantly objected to her leaving. "Your body is injured," they said. "At some point you might become ill again. We can easily foresee you're experiencing hardships there." Doe was furious, and in another act of social defiance, she told her parents that she was going to Tokyo despite their wishes. Before she left, she rented a room in Nagasaki to practice living on her own, and she worked at the cosmetics company's local shop and took odd jobs to save money. In 1955, her hair finally grew back enough for her to remove the black kerchief from her head. She was free. On the day of her departure, Doe, now 26, wrapped her clothes in 2 furoshiki, said goodbye to her family, and boarded a train for Tokyo. The trip took a day and a half. Her goal was to try to use the life she had been given. I felt like I'd already died once, she remembered. So if it didn't work out, I wouldn't have lost anything. From inside the slow, coal-burning train, Doe watched the city, her childhood, and her atomic bomb experiences disappear in the distance. Going to Tokyo was the true starting line of my life, she said. I bet against myself that I would win. So again, to close, I'm going to skip way ahead to the early and mid-2000s. In the meantime, survivors had an immense amount to contend with as they tried to redefine normalcy in the aftermath of nuclear war. Some of the many challenges were discrimination that they had in employment and in marriage, because potential employers were worried about their health and that they wouldn't be able to stay in their jobs, and the same for potential marriage partners who also had the added concern of the unknown potential genetic effects on their children. So many, probably most survivors, except those who were physically disfigured and who couldn't hide their identity, kept their hibakusha status secret, even often from their spouses and children. Now I'm going to tell you about Yoshida. He's an absolutely amazing, charming, kind, and hilarious man who I met when he was in his 70s. Yoshida, if you'll remember back at the beginning of the reading, was the 13-year-old boy who had been thrown back 130 feet into a rice paddy by the bomb's blast force. He's the one who likened the heat like he felt like dried grilled squid. His face at that time was severely burned and disfigured. And like Do, for years Yoshida remained hidden in his house, afraid of people's stares. But eventually he needed to work and found a job in the warehouse of a grocery wholesaler. I should say that in between that, he was finally hospitalized in December of 1945. He received no medical care for 4 months. His mother treated him at home, and he was unconscious the whole time. And he was finally taken to a naval hospital north of Nagasaki, about 22 miles, where he received medical care for the first time. And he had 3 skin grafts on his face. The first 2 didn't take. The third one did, although he remained very seriously disfigured the rest of his life. So here he is, this is now the early 50s, and he had to get a job as working as a grocery wholesaler. Each of the 5 survivors whose stories I tell in the book had personal moments of awareness or transformation that led to them deciding to speak publicly about their experiences, something that was rare in Japan for anyone, but most particularly for people of their generation. He and others were willing to do anything possible to ensure that Nagasaki is the last atomic bombed city in history. Here is Yoshida in his late 60s, and it's the story of the first time he spoke in front of a group, and then it skips to the 2007 when he's speaking in front of children at the Nagasaki Atomic Bomb Museum. Just a quick note to let you know what he looks like. He wears a large black patch to cover the place where his right ear used to be. The patch is secured by a black elastic band that runs underneath his chin, up the other side of his face, and across his nearly balded head now. Scar tissue covers his face and neck, and his left ear is shriveled. When he smiles, his mouth is crooked, revealing severely misshapen teeth. Behind large framed glasses, Yoshida's eyes are uneven, one higher than the other. Although Yoshida admired the hibakusha who chose to speak publicly and thought of them as pioneers, he himself remained silent. I was shy to be in front of people, especially women. Everyone looked at me like this. He grimaced. I didn't like it. One day, however, his friend Yamaguchi Senji approached Yoshida to ask if he could take his place at a talk he was scheduled to give to junior high school students visiting Nagasaki. Yoshida agreed, but when he arrived at the site and saw all the students staring at him, he immediately regretted it. Unraveled by the students' fear of making eye contact with him and what he thought was their revulsion, Yoshida stood before them and told his story. Some students began crying, and when Yoshida looked up at them, he nearly burst into tears himself. Afterward, many of the children expressed their appreciation to him. Yoshida, however, was so shaken by the experience that he returned momentarily to silence. But not for long. In his ongoing effort to accept his disfigurement, Yoshida came to terms with the fact that he could not change what had happened to him or how he looked, and he decided to no longer let his shyness get in the way of speaking out for peace. Outside the Nagasaki Atomic Bomb Museum in 2007, Yoshida turns toward the crowds of uniformed, talkative students lining up for tours and presentations by survivors. He locates the group of students that is scheduled to hear his story that day, greets the head teacher, then races to the head of the line to hold the museum door open for the class, urging them inside until the last child has entered. Now, he says, beaming, 9.5 out of 10 children don't cry when they see my face. To help the students feel comfortable, for years Yoshida has joked that he is as good-looking as Kimutaku, a handsome Japanese pop star from the 1990s. Now, however, Kimutaku, still a handsome actor in his 40s, no longer evokes the humorous comparison Yoshida intends. A colleague suggested that he update the actor he compares himself to, but Yoshida has never done so, except once in Chicago, when he likened his incredible good looks to those of Leonardo DiCaprio. In Nagasaki, however, even if children don't fully understand the reference, Yoshida's light-hearted twist on his appearance still gets children to smile. When they ask him for his autograph afterward, he signs it Grandpa Yoshida and adds in parentheses, Grandpa Kimutaku. This is what I say to children, he explains. Have you ever looked up heiwa, peace, in the dictionary? They never have. They never looked it up because we don't need to know what peace is during peacetime. Let's look it up together, he says to the children. He pauses and adds emphatically, our greatest enemy is carelessness. We need to pay attention to peace. Thank you. Now there's time for questions, anything at all that you'd like, or thoughts. Yes, and is this still on?
Yes, it is. We need.
So I'll repeat the questions. Okay.
When the bomb fell on Nagasaki, were people aware about what had happened a few days before in Hiroshima?
Only a few. The headlines were, the militaristic government in Japan did not want the Japanese people to know of defeats or military challenges they faced. So the headlines were some damage, Hiroshima, new bomb. Hiroshima was bombed with a new type of bomb, considerable damage done or something. It was not, it was minimized. And there were some people who had the great misfortune of being double survivors in both cities. And there were also a few people who happened to travel into Hiroshima on their way home. Hiroshima is on the main island of Honshu, and were coming back, say, from Tokyo. And so they were able to see the ruins, and they had come in and told their colleagues, co-workers, families about it. But mostly they didn't know at all. They had no idea. Yes?
The bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki were in the 20 kiloton range. They were really low pop firecracker.
Mm-hmm.
the largest size of an atomic device that has been exploded was by the Russians in 1961, and it was about 2,500 times that destructive power. Do you have any idea of what a world would look like if one of these mega devices exploded down?
So the question is that compared to the largest bomb that was detonated and tested by the Soviets in '61, which was 2,500 times greater, you're saying, than the bombing of Nagasaki. And do I have any sense of what a world would look like if one of those bombs were detonated? No. I think that it took so much for me to grasp and what it was like beneath this atomic cloud. And my understanding is still limited by history and distance. And so not only would whatever region of the world be so annihilated, but what that may trigger, what kind of responses that might trigger would be of great concern to me.
Have you investigated in contemporary military medical facilities, authorities, the sorts of advances that have taken place in, say, burn treatment or triage of mass casualties by whatever our knowledge accumulated during Vietnam and after might have given us?
So the question is, have I investigated the any new methodologies for treatment of burns and maybe radiation exposure that have been developed over the last 70 years? And the short answer to that is no. I am doing some research right now to try to understand the humanitarian impact of potential nuclear attacks now, but I'm at the bare early stage, so I don't really know. But there is, sometimes the survivors that I know or I've met, I have seen them become very frustrated and even a little angry when they hear about that the atomic, of course, the atomic bombs are being developed and are still being stored and militarized, but that there is no way a city or a region, anyone in the city, I mean, in Nagasaki, which is again that tiny bomb, relatively speaking, most of the doctors were killed, most of the medical staff, almost all the medicine was gone, and destroyed, and even though doctors poured in from other parts of the country to help, there was absolutely no way they could treat the vast number of injuries and radiation patients. And there was no way to treat radiation at the time, and there really still isn't. So the idea that, I mean, people do survive nuclear weapons, or they did back then. But the idea that you could come in and kind of rescue a city after a nuclear bomb happens seems, in the survivors' eyes, and I would tend to agree with them, a bit ludicrous. So, yes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Very, really good. From what's known, do we know anything? Because so the pretext is, I understand that the war was going to end in 2 weeks anyways, before the bombs were dropped, supposedly, from what's been said. Anyways, with that as a pretext, do we know anything from what's known? Were these bombs essentially dropped to measure? Was it just a measurement? Was it a test essentially on a mass city population?
So the question is that, was the war really ready to end anyway, and were these bombs dropped as as a test to understand their impact? There isn't an easy answer to that. The bomb's effects were measured when the bombs were dropped. Parachutes with canisters with scientific gauges to measure the heat, blast, and radiation effects were data was sent back to the planes. There is no definitive statement that one can say that the war was about to end. The Japanese government was split completely between those militarists, right-wing militarists who wanted to fight to the very end, to their death, and those who were petitioning for peace for quite a while before the bombs were dropped. And they couldn't reach agreement, and consensus was required in their government. So, but on the morning of the Nagasaki bombing, a half an hour before the bombing, the leaders of the Japanese cabinet, the main Japanese cabinet members, were already in another heated debate about surrender terms, and they heard about the Nagasaki bombing about 30 minutes after news had traveled to Tokyo, and they got news of it, but it was not part of the discussion. It did not become. In fact, one thing that, unless you're very studied, which certainly I wasn't when I began, the Soviets entered the war, the Pacific War, 11 hours before the Nagasaki bomb. The Soviets had, and the Japanese had been, I don't know if you'd call them allies, but I'm forgetting the term, where they agreed not to fight each other. But the Soviets, when the Potsdam Declaration was signed in June, had told the Allies that they would attack Japan within 3 months. And they did. And they attacked on August 9th at midnight. Would that be August 9th? Yes, I think so. And 11 hours later, Nagasaki was bombed. What seemed to have alarmed and caused grave concern for the cabinet leaders who were meeting all day and debating and arguing over whether to surrender or not was the Soviets' entry into the war, because Japan had really no ability to fight. It would cause them to have to fight on two fronts instead of one, the Pacific theater. And that seems to be the topic, the main thrust of all the debates that happened. And the emperor, who broke the stalemate at 1 a.m, that next middle of the night, 1 a.m. on August 10th, again, nothing was mentioned about Nagasaki. Another important, let me just add one more thing that was an important, at least information to consider, because there are such strong opinions on both sides of this. The bombs were absolutely not necessary, and the bombs were absolutely necessary, and they ended the war and saved 1 million American lives. The best historians, I analyzed a lot because I wanted to try to find out what I thought about this. And I found out that at least I came to the conclusion that there isn't any definitive answer, because there are two amazing historians who work against any bias they may have to really analyze all of the facts, compared to those historians who are very biased on one side or the other. And they can't come to a very definitive conclusion that that either bomb was necessary, but the Nagasaki bomb gets a stronger opinion that it wasn't necessary to end the war. It does, but it's still not definitive. And there wasn't a second order. There wasn't a second military assessment for the need of the Nagasaki bombing, or a second order. President Truman signed a single military order to use the atomic weapons as ready. That was the term, as ready. And the decision to use the bombs, to deliver them, and the timing of the bombs were made by the military leaders in the South Pacific. And Nagasaki wasn't scheduled to be, Nagasaki wasn't even the target that day. That's a whole other story. That was a secondary target. because the planes couldn't visually see the first target, so they had to turn toward Nagasaki, which was the backup target that day. But the second atomic bomb was scheduled to be delivered, I think it was about a week after August 9th. But rain was predicted, bad weather was predicted, and they wanted to have a visual sighting of the city before they dropped the bomb, and so they moved it forward to when there would be clear weather. So there are all these complicated factors that are very hard to assess and know for sure definitively. Sure.
The data went back to the planes. Which planes? And anything known about Truman misled? My understanding is it's kind of like an early day Bush Jr. kind of thing, where he was kind of misled and etc. or supposedly
Misled before the dropping of the bombs or after? So he said that he's asking if Truman was misled by the military advisors before the bombing. I have not read about that in the histories of these excellent historians. I have not read about that. Was there one more? And then, well, there were supposed to be 3 planes. One had the bomb, one had the observation plane, and one was the filming, the airplanes, yeah. And over Nagasaki, one got lost on the way at the rendezvous point. So when it got to Nagasaki, there were only 2 planes, but that's where the data was supposed to go back to. Yes.
Just say that you answered this and you don't want to bore everyone else. Fukushima, did your survivors talk at all about Fukushima? And the second question is the resettling people into Fukushima, just the way they resettle people at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. My understanding of radiation is the half-life is thousands of years, that the evil effects just don't go away with the wind blowing it away. Did they understand the effects of settling people in a place that's highly radioactive?
So the question has to do with the radioactivity in Fukushima, and the resettling that's going on there now, and the radioactivity and the resettling that happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki after the war. I know less about Fukushima. The survivors do talk about it, or they did at the time. It terrified them. It caused PTSD reactions for them. Nagasaki is very far away, though, from Fukushima, so they kind of had that distance, which may have helped them some. As it relates to resettling, it's a complex question because the U.S. military came in mid-September to occupy Japan, and they sent in teams of military scientists to measure the radiation levels in both cities prior to sending in troops, the occupation troops. And they deemed that the levels were above normal, but not in any toxic range. The complication around that comes with a number of U.S. veterans who were in Nagasaki and Hiroshima and who had extraordinary lifelong cancers, and their children had cancers, things like that. But there is no way to be able to specifically say that those were caused by the radiation. So it's very complex, and certainly most people didn't get, most of the soldiers weren't affected that way. So I can't say more than what I know. Yes.
What very graphically, dramatically illustrates is that after this vacuum of medical supplies, of means of caring for these patients, the ones who did survive severe radiation illness, burns, later tumors, survived because family members took care of them. That was the main source of care I pictured in these 5 people who described their lives after the early bombing, the mother diligently caring for the young boy for years and years and years. That was the night of comparing him.
Yes, he's saying that perhaps the survivors who did survive both the bombing and then the survival after the bombing, it may in large part be due to the care of family members. That is certainly true to a large extent. 3 of the 5 survivors whose stories are told throughout the book were very seriously injured or irradiated or burned, and they all had the care of family members. There are those who survived without the care of family members or distant relatives. They were either shipped out to the homes of distant relatives, or distant relatives came in and took care of them. So it's not completely 100%, but it's certainly true.
Has Donald Trump read your book?
I'm guessing not. The question is, has Donald Trump read my book? I wouldn't guess that it's on the top of his reading list, but it would be wonderful if he did.
Mandatory, it should be this book.
Oh, thank you. He said this book should be mandatory reading if it were possible. Yes.
Yes, thank you. I had 2 questions. The first one, were there any books that served as models or inspired you, like the book Hiroshima? And also, what do you attribute the censorship about this in Japan itself? Because I can understand censorship here in the United States, but I was surprised that they even censor information about this in Japan.
So the question has to do with, well, censorship. What was the first question again?
Models, books
Oh, yeah.
that inspired
If
you.
there were any models of books that inspired me, well, certainly I read Hersey's book when I was much younger, and I don't know that there were any books that specifically inspired me in the structure of this book. It was quite a sojourn to make it come to life. As for censorship, I didn't tell you about the censorship in this particular reading, but General MacArthur, when he went in and led the U.S. occupation forces for 6 years, instituted a very strict press code that it didn't last for 6 years. It lasted for 3.5 or 4 years, which prevented any story from being published in the paper or on the radio that could be perceived as anti-American and had to be deemed truthful by the U.S. censors. So every story had to go to the occupation censorship office and be screened before it then came back either edited out or approved or whatever. And although the atomic bombing reports were not directly prevented in the language of the press code, they ultimately were, because anything about the atomic bombs would have been perceived as a negative against the Americans. So the hibakusha were isolated, completely isolated within their own country, because the only news that anyone in Japan ever got about the atomic bombs in the first 4 years after the bombing was between August 9th, when the bombing happened, and about September 15th, so about a 3-week period when MacArthur instituted the press code. And then everything stopped. So no one knew what was going on in the cities. And doctors weren't allowed to publish their papers, their research on what was going on. So that affected their ability to treat the hibakusha as well. Yeah. Anything else percolating in your mind? Yes.
I was wondering why the 2 cities were chosen. I came in a little late. You may have already this.
No, not at all. In fact, I didn't mark it. I haven't. I marked it the other day. So by August of 1945, 64 Japanese cities had already been either firebombed or conventionally bombed in a country that's about the size of California. So in the spring of 1945, when the planning for the delivery of the bombs was going on, the Target Committee, the U.S. Target Committee, chose a number of cities that had not been destroyed yet. And their criteria were that they had included, they had to be close enough to Tinian Island, where they were taking off in the south, in the Marshall Islands in the South Pacific, to make it there and back with the fuel that the B-29s could hold. That's one. So it couldn't be in northern Japan, for example. The second is it had to have, the cities had to have a factory with workers' residences around it. The third is it needed to be a certain size. The fourth was that it couldn't have been destroyed enough that would minimize, they wanted to, I've forgotten the wording, I have it in here. They wanted to make sure that the bombing was spectacular enough to make international news and become a force, an international force after the bombings happened. So there were all these considerations, and as I said, Nagasaki was at the top of the list, but it wasn't the second one at the time. Thank you. Thank you all so much.
All right, folks, if there are no more questions, then a reminder to our internet audience watching at home, there's still time for you to call the number on your screen, and we can ship Nagasaki to wherever you are in the U.S. free of charge. For those of you here in the house, we have the book for sale at the counter in the front room over there. Susan will be signing here to the left of the podium, and this has been a fascinating presentation. Please give another hand to Susan Southard. Thank you very much. Thank you, Susan. Very good.